Hello. Hi everyone. Welcome to the first Access and Benefit Sharing webinar. You'll all join muted and without video because we've had over 150 people sign up. So that's excellent. Just a quick run through of what will happen today. We'll do a half-an-hour presentation. Rob will start this and then I'll do the second half of the presentation. After this, we'll answer any questions that you may have. So please put these in the Q&A function on the side of the screen. If there's any questions that you want answered, please press the thumbs up button, and that way we just know which ones we'll answer first. So in case you don't already know me, I'm Katie Bird. I am an enforcement officer for Access and Benefit Sharing in the UK. I've been in the job since December 2018, and that's pretty much it. So I'll now hand over to Rob to introduce himself, and then we'll get started on the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Katie said, my name is Rob. I have a background in marine science and I've worked in the ABS team for about a year and a half now. I'll be taking you through the first half of this presentation, so hopefully we'll have the slides up in a second. Just wait a moment for them to pop up. Okay, there we are. So if we could skip to the content slide, that would be great. Thank you. So I'll just introduce the government departments that are responsible for access and benefit sharing in the UK. We'll then watch a short video, which is just a background and introduction to the Nagoya Protocol. I'll then cover a bit about the history and the background and the aims of the Nagoya Protocol and what it's aiming to achieve, before introducing the regulations that are enforced in the UK. At that point, I'll hand over to Katie, who will talk you through what these regulations mean for users of genetic resources, so practically how to comply, and also our approach to enforcement. And at that stage, we'll then go on to the Q&A session and answer any questions that you have in the chat. So the ABS team in the UK is split across two government departments. Firstly, DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. DEFRA acts as the policy lead for access and benefit sharing in the UK, and they have the national focal point, who is Keith Barber. So he's the main contact point for any ABS related questions in the UK. Both myself and Katie work for the Office for Product Safety and Standards, which is part of BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and we act as a competent national authority for access and benefit sharing in the UK. So our role is revolves around the implementation and enforcement of access and benefit sharing. And our office has experience with other technical as well as product-based regulations with an environmental focus, such as the EU timber regulations, which aim to prevent illegal logging. So at this stage, before I go on to talk about the aims of the Nagoya Protocol, we'll just watch this short introductory video.
Since the beginning of humankind, we have been taking advantage of what Mother Nature provides for us. From using animals, cereals, and plants, to discovering the first antibiotic, we have come a long way. We know our world is rich. Animals, plants, and microorganisms contain billions of useful genetic resources. Some are already widely known, and many of them are being used to produce medicine, food, cosmetics, and other important things. But a huge part of what nature holds for us still remains undiscovered. Take a plant, for example, deeply hidden in the rainforest. Only the local people may be aware of what the plant can be used for. Yet, its genetic composition could be useful to millions of people all over our planet. Sharing and using the world's genetic resources is important for the progress of humankind. This is why we need internationally agreed terms for ABS, access and benefit sharing, with regard to genetic resources. how to access genetic resources and share the benefits between those who use them and those who provide them in a fair and equitable way is illustrated in ABS Simply Explained. Every country holds rights over animals, plants, and genetic resources found within its borders. Anyone from another country who wants to use such resources must respect these sovereign rights. That was agreed upon by 172 countries at the UN Rio Summit in 1992, when the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, was born. The Convention on Biological Diversity and its Bonn Guidelines define the ABS principles. An interested foreign researcher or company may only access a genetic resource if allowed by the providing country. This also includes traditional knowledge that is associated with the genetic resource, because traditional knowledge held by indigenous and local communities often plays an important role in the discovery of new active ingredients in genetic resources. In accordance with national legislation, a PIC, a prior informed consent, needs to be obtained from the providing country. The PIC request should outline the nature and the intended goal of the planned research and utilization. The MAT, the mutually agreed terms, will then define the benefits for the provider of the genetic resource as well as further contractual issues. These benefits could be monetary, such as a lump sum payment or a share of the profit, or non-monetary, such as a transfer of knowledge, technology, or training. These rules apply to commercial users and, on the basis of special considerations, also to non-commercial users. The idea behind this concept is to help conserve our biodiversity by sharing the benefits from its utilization in a fair and equitable way. In 2010, the Nagoya Protocol fleshed out and specified the access and benefit sharing principles of the CBD for countries providing and using genetic resources in a legally binding way. All the concepts explained so far are now part of the protocol. The protocol is to enhance legal certainty for all parties involved in the utilization of genetic resources. And another important element was added to the protocol. Official checkpoints now have to be designated in countries where genetic resources are being utilized. Along the research and development chain, these checkpoints will help verify whether PIC has been obtained and MAT have been established. The collected information will then be sent to a specific public database where it can be reviewed by the country that has provided access to the resource. This procedure allows for the tracking of a genetic resource from provider to user all the way to innovation and potential commercialization. This helps to ensure fair sharing of benefits if a product based on a genetic resource is introduced to the market. Now, all ratifying countries need to translate the provisions of the Nagoya Protocol into domestic laws or regulations that reflect the interests of all stakeholders concerned. ABS, implemented properly, holds great potential for multiple benefits for users, providers, and for the conservation of nature.
So, as explained in the video, basically the whole reason why the Nagoya Protocol exists is because of the value of biodiversity and traditional knowledge associated with this biodiversity. So we use biodiversity for all sorts of things nowadays, so whether that's from advancing the way we produce food to using them in the development of pharmaceutical products or cosmetic products. And sometimes research into the applications of biodiversity also utilize the traditional knowledge of indigenous communities in the countries providing the genetic resources. However, the countries with the technology and the facilities and sometimes also the expertise to undertake this research and development on genetic resources are not necessarily the same as the countries which are hotspots of biodiversity hold a wealth of traditional knowledge and are the main providers of these resources. So many countries felt that their biodiversity and their traditional knowledge was being exploited. And in addition, we have the problem that biodiversity is threatened by climate change and other human activities worldwide. So the United Nations Environment Programme put together a task force to try and address these issues. And what they came up with was the idea for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this was open for signature at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and it came into force just after Christmas in 1993. And the convention has three main aims. These are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, and the third and wordiest objective, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilisation of genetic resources. So by genetic resources, we mean plants, animals, microbes, basically anything with a gene. And by utilisation, we mean research and development into the genetic or biochemical properties of those genetic resources. So sorry, my slide's lagging a bit behind. So effectively what this means is that every country can choose to exercise sovereign rights over its genetic resources. This means that they can choose to implement access measures for anyone wanting to come into the country to access the genetic resources. They'll have to ask permission first, and they can require those users to enter into agreements to agree the terms of use. And that can also include benefit sharing agreements. However, at this stage, the system felt fairly incomplete. So while the provider countries could implement the access and benefit sharing laws within their countries, they struggled to track and monitor the utilisation of their genetic resources once they had left the provider country. So to try and address these issues, the convention introduced the Bonn guidelines to access to genetic resources. So the Bonn guidelines were a voluntary international framework which outlined the system for predictable access to genetic resources and tracking and monitoring their utilisation. Obviously, being a voluntary framework, there wasn't any legal consequences for those that didn't comply. So these Bonn guidelines were adapted into what became the Nagoya Protocol. And what the Nagoya Protocol adds to the Bonn guidelines is basically a legal requirement for those countries using genetic resources to implement compliance laws to ensure that researchers in their country are complying with the laws of the provider country. So on the same date that the Nagoya Protocol came into force, the EU introduced the compliance measures, and these are the compliance measures that are currently in force in the UK today. Following on from that, the EU introduced the implementing regulation, which gave more detailed description of how to comply with the regulation, and then following on from that, the EU guidance. So what the Nagoya Protocol adds to this existing world of access and benefit sharing is this pillar of compliance. So if a researcher from the UK wants to travel overseas to access the genetic resources or traditional knowledge in another country, they'll have to comply with both the provider country access and benefit sharing laws and the compliance measures that are in force in the UK today. And it's these compliance measures that will be the focus of this presentation. So to be in scope of the EU regulation, the country providing the genetic resource or traditional knowledge must have ratified the Nagoya Protocol or be party to the Nagoya Protocol, and it needs to regulate access to its genetic resources through established access measures. The genetic resource itself needs to have been accessed after the 12th of October 2014. If you remember from a few slides ago, this was the date that both the Nagoya Protocol and the EU compliance measures came into force. And genetic resources which are already governed by a specialised international instrument are considered out of scope of the regulations because they are considered to already comply with access and benefit sharing. So the two recognised international instruments are the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework and the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. So both of these frameworks have access and benefit sharing built into them. So by following those systems, we're confident that you're compliant with access and benefit sharing. So in terms of the type of work that's in scope, the regulation defines utilisation as research and development on the genetic or biochemical composition of genetic resources, including for the application of biotechnology. So on this slide are some examples, and these are taken directly from the EU guidance. So these include research on a genetic resource that leads to the isolation of a biochemical compound that's used as an ingredient in a pharmaceutical product. It could also be the creation or improvement of, in this example, a yeast, which is results from an R&D process and used in manufacturing process, and also genetic modification. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but some examples to give you an idea of the type of work that's in scope. So the simple maintenance and management of a collection of genetic resources for conservation purposes would be considered out of scope of the regulation, and that's because it's not undertaking research and development into the biology or biochemical properties or genetics of the organism. It's simply maintaining a collection of that genetic resource. Similarly, handling and storing of genetic resources and simply describing what it looks like is also out of scope. And if you're using the genetic resource as a testing tool, rather than using it as the subject of the research, that's also out of scope. However, if you're developing a testing tool, that might bring the work into scope. And simply going back to the collection example I used, while storing genetic resources out of scope, collections can actually be very useful in facilitating compliance by providing information to their customers, which Katie will touch on a little bit later. Simple identification of a genetic resource or describing its interaction with its environment, so anything like ecological, is out of scope, and also utilising human genetic resources is out of scope. So the scope that I've just been talking about is obviously in force in the UK and is relevant to researchers in the UK. However, it's important to always seek and comply with the access and benefit sharing laws in the provider country. So there can be cases where there's access and benefit sharing laws in the provider country that you'll need to comply with, but you're out of scope of our compliance measures. So for example, Brazil is not a party to the Nagoya Protocol, and therefore it falls out of scope of our compliance measures. Brazil does, however, have access and benefit sharing legislation. So you'd have to comply with Brazil's in-country ABS laws, but you would fall out of scope of the compliance laws in the UK, which means that we won't be able to enforce the Brazilian laws in the UK. Hopefully that makes sense. Please feel free to add any questions to the chat if that's not clear to you. But at this point, I'll hand over to Katie, who will talk you through the practical steps towards compliance.
Thank you, Rob. So now Rob's covered the legislation in the background, I'm going to cover the more practical side. So what it means for users, what does compliance look like, and our enforcement of it in the UK. So in this example here, we've identified a genetic resource that we want to access. And the first step in compliance is we need to exercise due diligence to make sure that we access it from the country of origin legally. So the first step here that we would recommend is checking the ABS clearinghouse. This is a screenshot of the ABS clearinghouse, and if you haven't been on the website before, the link is there at the bottom so that you can copy that across. If the genetic resource that we're trying to access in this example, if it's from Kenya, we can click into the country profile. And the ABS clearinghouse has all this really useful information on it that countries can upload. There's contact details for the national focal point and the competent national authority. There's legislation on access and benefit sharing for that country, a simplified ABS access procedure, internationally recognised certificates of compliance, checkpoint communiques, which I'll touch on a bit later, and also national websites and databases as well for more information. So using this information, we can sometimes identify if we're in or out of scope of that provider country legislation. If it's not clear, then we would recommend contacting the national focal point or competent national authority. We'd also recommend searching for more information, perhaps on the national website of that country. And if you're struggling to find any information or get in touch with that provider country, then please drop us an email, because then we can give you advice on what's acceptable with regards to due diligence and how you can proceed. So what we mean by exercising due diligence is making judgments and decisions that can be reasonably expected by gathering information. It's not intended to guarantee a perfect outcome, but it calls for thoroughness and your best possible efforts. It should also be adaptable so that greater care can be applied to riskier situations. It also involves staying up to date on information, whether that's information that's been uploaded on the ABS Clearinghouse or information that gets published in relation to that country and access and benefit sharing. So this is the kind of information we would look to see to support due diligence. If it's in scope, we would look for the information that's legally required in Article 4 of the EU regulation. So that's either an internationally recognised certificate of compliance, which I'll go in a bit more detail in the next slide about how you can get an internationally recognised certificate of compliance. Or alternatively, the date and place of access of the genetic resource, the description, the source of the genetic resource, where you got it from, and then if it's applicable to the country, access measures, access permits, so a PIC, prior informed consent, or mutually agreed terms. If the material you're accessing is out of scope of the EU compliance measures or the provider country legislation, then we might look to see a screenshot of the ABS Clearinghouse where the country is not a party to the Nagoya Protocol, an email from the national focal point or the competent national authority stating that there are no access measures. We will also possibly look for reference to legislation stating that a specific exemption that matches that research, or a description of your utilisation with examples and evidence that it's out of scope of the EU compliance measures. Here again, I will point out that even if you're out of scope of the EU compliance measures, you might still be in scope of the provider country access measures, and you should always comply with the provider country laws. So going back to this example, could go one of two ways. Either there are no access measures to follow, so you can just go ahead and access the material, or they do have access measures which you'll need to follow. And usually this will be a prior informed consent, so that access permit, and mutually agreed terms that you negotiate with the provider country. The provider country might upload these two documents to the ABS Clearinghouse and maybe supporting information, and that will create an internationally recognised certificate of compliance. This just makes it a bit easier for you because then you only have the one document that you need to keep a track of. And according to the regulations, you have to keep this information for 20 years. So you don't have to have the IRCC, or you don't have to wait for it to be uploaded, and you can just keep that information that I mentioned that's under Article 4. So now we're moving on to the research and development stage. You've accessed the material and start your research. At this stage, you might start sharing benefits as well. So maybe working with in-country partners, delivering lectures, sharing reports. You might also develop a product from this. So you might be able to share some monetary benefits. If this wasn't the intention from the start, if you suddenly realise that you've got the potential for a product after doing the initial research, you might need to renegotiate the mutually agreed terms with that provider country. Along this stage as well is where you might need to submit a due diligence declaration. So if you're doing research and development in the UK, there are two stages for submitting a due diligence declaration, and that's either after receiving research funding for a project or before placing a product on the market. Currently, these due diligence declarations are submitted through the EU platform Declare, and once a declaration is received, as long as nothing essential is confidential, then it will be uploaded onto the ABS Clearinghouse as a checkpoint communique. So I've put this rather wordy slide in so that you can see the regulations wording of this. But in the event of a public health emergency, if you're working on the causing pathogen of a public health emergency, such as SARS-CoV-2, then you still have to comply with the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing in the country where you're getting the pathogen from. But your compliance obligations in the UK are delayed by either 3 months after utilisation or 1 month after the threat has passed. If you have any questions on this, or if you're working on SARS-CoV-2 from different countries, since the UK doesn't have any access measures, so for UK genetic resources, you don't need to, you don't fall under the compliance aspect of the EU regulations. But if you do have any questions, please get in touch and we can answer anything relating to this. I'll now touch briefly on registered collections and best practice as well. A registered collection is a collection that's been verified by a competent national authority to apply procedures to only supply genetic resources with evidence that they've been collected legally. In the regulations, if you get material from a registered collection, then you have exercised your due diligence, so there is no failure to comply with that aspect of the regulations. There are currently 3 registered collections in the EU, and when we send these slides out after, you'll be able to click on that link and see which ones they are. But you can also, if you have collections that you use regularly that you think would be good for them to be registered collections, feel free to suggest it to them. We're always looking for more for registered collections in the UK. There's also best practices. So there's currently 1 registered best practice in the EU, and these are a collection of procedures and tools that are developed that, when effectively implemented, ensure compliance. So if you can show that you're effectively implementing a best practice that you oversee and that you've developed that's registered as a best practice, then there is no failure to comply with the regulations, since they're designed to help users comply. So now the post-transition period. After the transition period at the end of this year, the UK will remain a party to the Nagoya Protocol in its own right. So user obligations will stay the same, so you'll still, this presentation will still be relevant. But there will be a new procedure for applying for registered collections and best practice, and also for submitting due diligence declarations. UK stakeholders have also previously submitted feedback on the proposed EU guidance document. This is expected to come into effect in the EU later this year, and the current EU guidance has formed the basis for the UK guidance that comes into effect after the transition period. We are reviewing with DEFRA, that's OPSS, are reviewing with DEFRA all aspects of the guidance, and further details and dialogue opportunities will be available in due course. There will also be dialogue opportunities around the work DEFRA has undertaken on DSI, digital sequencing information. The results of their commissioned research haven't been finalised yet, but will help shape DEFRA's understanding of the issues. The Aichi biodiversity targets end this year as well, being replaced with the draft ones that are proposed under the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Discussions on the targets and goals are ongoing. No final decision is expected until the CBD conference of the parties in spring 2021. Discussions with stakeholders will take place as the work on this continues, and we can pass on any comments on any of that to DEFRA. So there is lots of support available for users. I've detailed a lot of these here. There's just I've also put up a selection of really useful websites. We can't recommend any specific websites, but these are really useful for lots of information on the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing in general. There is also a LinkedIn forum that we've got, and there is also an email address that you can contact us on. So if you've got any questions that aren't answered in this presentation or in the Q&A session, then please feel free to drop us an email. I'll also now move on to how we enforce ABS in the UK. So here in the UK, we enforce in line with the regulators code. So we support compliance and growth, we engage with those we regulate, we base our activity on risk, share information, offer clear guidance, and are transparent. We also don't just take enforcement action because an organisation asks a question or highlights a problem. If we do spot a non-compliance, we do have a set of measures that we can take. So we would start with education and advice and guidance, and the approach we have previously taken for enforcing this regulation has been only through education and advice and guidance. We are now more likely to issue either a warning letter, a compliance notice, or stop notice if we see a non-compliance. We're also legally obliged to publish the sanctions that we issue. Sometimes this is more of an incentive to comply than the notices themselves. So our enforcement so far, we haven't been conducting enforcement audits recently so as to not put more burden on businesses during the coronavirus outbreak, but we will be restarting these soon. We start our enforcement by requesting a list of projects, and we'll then select a specific project based on risk to get more information on that project and check compliance with the regulations. We will also look at processes and procedures that you've got. These aren't a legal requirement, but we find they are useful. We might be able to suggest internal checkpoints and other internal procedures that you can implement that might help with future compliance. After the meeting, we'll provide you feedback if the project was compliant or not, any actions that you should take, or any notices we need to issue, as well as feedback on processes and procedures that we speak through in the meeting. So far, the audits we have conducted, we've found no cases of non-compliance. And on that good news, that's it for the presentation. So now